The next few hours passed in a blur of official procedures that Margaret had only ever seen in television shows. She was formally arrested, photographed, and fingerprinted while struggling to understand how her simple complaint about poor customer service had transformed into a criminal matter. Each step of the process drove home the reality that she was no longer dealing with retail workers or restaurant managers who could be browbeaten into submission. Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, had seen plenty of tourists who got carried away during palace visits, but Margaret's case was particularly striking. As she reviewed the security footage and witness statements, she found herself watching someone whose entire world view seemed to be collapsing in real time. "The thing that strikes me about this case," Detective Inspector Walsh later told her colleagues, "is how completely unprepared she was for the consequences of her actions. Most people who assault security personnel have some understanding that they're crossing a serious line. This woman genuinely seemed to believe that grabbing a Royal Guard's weapon was equivalent to getting a shop assistant's attention." Margaret sat in the interview room, still wearing the same outfit she had carefully selected for her palace tour, now wrinkled and stained with her own nervous perspiration. Her perfectly styled hair had become disheveled during the arrest process, and her makeup had smeared from the tears she had been trying not to shed. For the first time in decades, she looked exactly like what she was, a middle-aged woman who had made a terrible mistake. "I want you to understand something, Mrs. Henderson," Detective Inspector Walsh said as she began the formal interview. "What happened today isn't going to disappear because you're embarrassed about it. You didn't just have an argument with a shopkeeper. You committed assault on a member of the Royal Guard in one of the most secure locations in Britain. That has consequences that extend far beyond hurt feelings or damaged pride." Margaret nodded weakly, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of her situation. The legal terms being used around her weren't the kind that got resolved with angry phone calls or strongly worded letters to management. Words like assault, breach of security, and potential terrorist threat carried weight that her usual tactics couldn't diminish. The detective spread out printed screenshots from various social media platforms, each showing different angles of Margaret's confrontation with Guardsman Mitchell. The images had been shared thousands of times already, accompanied by comments that ranged from disbelief to outright mockery. Margaret stared at the photos with growing horror, seeing herself through the eyes of strangers who had witnessed her public meltdown. "The internet has not been kind to your behavior today," Detective Walsh observed with professional detachment. "You're currently trending on several platforms under hashtags that I wouldn't recommend Googling. More importantly, from a legal standpoint, we have multiple video recordings of the incident from different angles, plus testimony from dozens of witnesses, including several serving police officers who were in the crowd." Margaret's phone, which had been confiscated during her arrest, had been buzzing constantly with calls from friends and family members who had seen the viral videos. Her nephew David had already given his statement to police, describing his aunt's behavior as completely out of character, while simultaneously acknowledging that she had a long history of creating scenes in public when she didn't get her way. The legal process that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Her usual strategy of escalating complaints until someone in authority gave her what she wanted was useless in a system designed to deal with actual criminals rather than dissatisfied customers. Every lawyer she consulted gave her the same basic advice: plead guilty, express genuine remorse, and hope for leniency from a judge who might understand that she was more foolish than dangerous. The court proceedings were a further humiliation. Margaret found herself standing before a judge who had dealt with genuine terrorists and serious criminals, trying to explain why she thought grabbing a Royal Guard's weapon was an appropriate response to poor customer service. The viral videos were played in open court, showing her behavior from multiple angles to a courtroom full of observers who clearly thought she was either dangerous or ridiculous. "Mrs. Henderson, the judge said after reviewing all the evidence. "I want to be very clear about something. The security arrangements around the royal family exist for reasons that have nothing to do with customer service or tourism revenue. When you crossed that barrier and put your hands on that guardsman's weapon, you weren't expressing dissatisfaction with a tour package. You were potentially threatening national security." The sentence, when it came, was both more and less than Margaret had feared. She avoided jail time, largely because her complete incompetence as a potential threat had convinced everyone involved that she was more embarrassing than dangerous. However, she received a substantial fine, community service hours, and most devastatingly, a permanent ban from all royal properties and events. The community service assignment was particularly fitting. Margaret found herself working at a tourist information center, helping visitors plan their London experiences and answering questions about proper behavior around royal properties. The irony was not lost on her supervisors, who made sure she understood that her job was to help tourists avoid making the same mistakes she had made. Her first day of community service was a profound lesson in humility. Margaret had to explain to confused tourists why certain behaviors were inappropriate around royal guards, knowing that many of them had probably seen the viral videos of her own spectacular failure. Each conversation was a reminder of how completely she had misunderstood the situation she had inserted herself into. The long-term consequences extended far beyond her legal punishment. Margaret's social media presence became a cautionary tale shared in training materials for tourist guides and security personnel. Her friends and family members found themselves defending or distancing themselves from her actions in conversations that continued long after the legal proceedings had ended. Perhaps most significantly, Margaret was forced to confront the reality that her lifetime strategy of demanding special treatment had finally encountered a situation where such demands were not only ineffective, but actually criminal. The royal guard who had stood motionless while she grabbed his weapon had been doing his job exactly as he was trained to do. Her assumption that she deserved different treatment because of her citizenship, her tax contributions, or her personal desires had been completely irrelevant to the situation. Months later, as Margaret completed her community service hours, she would often think about those few seconds when her hand was wrapped around Guardsman Mitchell's sword. In her memory, she could still see his eyes as he looked directly at her for the first and only time during their encounter. There had been no anger there, no personal offense taken at her behavior, just the cold professional assessment of a trained soldier dealing with a potential threat. That look had taught her something that decades of getting her own way had never shown her. There were people in the world who simply could not be bullied, demanded from, or manipulated into submission. Some lines, once crossed, led to consequences that couldn't be argued away, no matter how loudly or persistently someone complained. Margaret Henderson had finally learned what it meant to face real authority, and the lesson had cost her far more than the price of a premium palace tour.